Have you ever trusted someone so completely, so blindly, that the thought of their betrayal seemed impossible? Have you ever looked into the eyes of the people who gave you life and wondered if they were capable of destroying it? I did. And what I discovered shattered every belief I had about family, trust, and unconditional love. My name doesn't matter right now, but my story does, because it's a story about how the two people who were supposed to protect me became the ones who tried to destroy me financially, emotionally, and legally. This isn't just about money. This is about manipulation, deceit, and the moment when a single document exposed years of calculated betrayal. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, if you've ever questioned whether fighting back was worth it, stay with me, because what happened in that courtroom changed everything I thought I knew about justice and family. I'm going to take you through every painful moment, every shocking revelation, every sleepless night, and ultimately, the victory that came at a cost I never imagined I'd have to pay. This is my truth, raw and unfiltered, and I'm sharing it because I know somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they're not alone in facing family betrayal, that standing up for yourself isn't wrong, and that justice, though difficult to achieve, is worth fighting for. I was 28 years old when my world started crumbling, though I didn't realize it at first. I had worked hard my entire adult life, building a career in digital marketing, saving every penny I could, investing wisely, and creating a life I was proud of. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was comfortable, stable, and independent. I had a nice apartment in a good neighborhood, a reliable car that I had paid off, a retirement account that was growing steadily, and enough savings to feel secure. My parents had always been proud of me, or so I thought. They would brag to their friends about my accomplishments, show off photos of my apartment, my car, my life. They'd tell people how successful I was, how I had exceeded their expectations, how they had raised me right. Looking back now, I see the glint in their eyes differently. What I once interpreted as pride was actually something much darker: envy, calculation, greed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment when the first crack appeared in the perfect family portrait I had always believed in. I need you to understand who I was before all this happened because it matters. I was the dutiful daughter, the one who called every Sunday, who visited on holidays, who sent birthday cards and remembered anniversaries. I believed in family loyalty above almost everything else. My parents had raised me with traditional values, emphasizing that blood is thicker than water, that family takes care of family, that you never turn your back on the people who raised you. Those values were deeply ingrained in me, woven into the very fabric of who I was as a person, and those same values would later be used as weapons against me. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday evening in March. I remember the exact day because I had just closed a major deal at work, landing a client that would bring in substantial revenue for my company and earn me a generous bonus. I was celebrating with takeout sushi and a glass of wine, feeling accomplished and content, sitting on my couch and scrolling through Netflix trying to decide what to watch. My phone buzzed and I saw my mother's name on the screen. Nothing unusual about that. We talked regularly, maintained what I thought was a close relationship. I answered cheerfully, ready to share my good news about the client, but her voice sounded strained, worried, trembling in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten with concern. She was crying, which was rare for my mother who prided herself on being strong and composed. She told me that she and my father were facing serious financial difficulties, that they had made some bad investments, that they were at risk of losing their house. The house I grew up in, filled with memories, with birthday parties and holiday dinners and lazy Sunday mornings. The house where I had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I had my first kiss on the front porch, where every room held pieces of my childhood. My heart broke for them. The thought of my parents losing their home, struggling financially in what should be their comfortable retirement years, was devastating to me. Without hesitation, without suspicion, without even questioning the details, I offered to help. That's what family does, right? You help each other. You sacrifice. You support. I had no idea that this moment of compassion, this instinctive desire to protect the people who raised me, would be the beginning of my nightmare. My mother's relief was palpable through the phone. She thanked me profusely, told me I was saving them, told me she didn't know what they would do without me. She said my father was too ashamed to call me himself, that he felt like he had failed as a provider, that the weight of their financial troubles was crushing him. She painted a picture of desperation that tugged at every emotional string I had. We talked for over an hour that night, with her explaining the situation in vague but alarming terms. They had invested in some real estate ventures that had fallen through. They had medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. They had outstanding debts from a period when my father had been between jobs years ago that were suddenly being called in. Each explanation seemed plausible, and I didn't think to question them. Why would I? These were my parents. The idea that they might be lying to me was so far outside my realm of possibility that it never even entered my mind. That night, after we hung up, I immediately logged into my bank account and transferred $5,000 to them. It seemed like the least I could do. They had given me life, raised me, supported me through college, been there for every major milestone. Now it was my turn to be there for them. I felt good about helping, felt like I was finally able to give back after years of receiving. I went to bed that night feeling like a good daughter, like someone who understood what family truly meant. I had no idea I had just taken the first step into a carefully constructed trap. Over the next few months, the requests continued with increasing frequency. First, it was another $3,000 for medical bills my father supposedly had from a procedure that insurance denied. Then it was $7,000 for urgent home repairs that couldn't wait. Then $10,000 for legal fees related to their investment issues. Each time they had explanations that seemed reasonable, documents that looked legitimate, tears that appeared genuine. I trusted them completely. Why wouldn't I? These were my parents, the people who had raised me, fed me, clothed me, sent me to college. The thought that they might be lying never crossed my mind. I drained my savings account, watching the balance that had taken me years to accumulate disappear in a matter of months. I borrowed against my retirement fund, accepting the penalties and tax consequences without hesitation, because helping my parents seemed more important than my future financial security. I even took out a personal loan at a high interest rate, adding monthly payments I could barely afford to my already tight budget. Meanwhile, my own bills started piling up. I began eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, skipping meals sometimes to save money. I canceled my gym membership, stopped getting my hair done professionally, started buying clothes from thrift stores. I stopped seeing friends because I couldn't afford to go out for coffee or dinner. When they asked what was wrong, I made excuses about being busy with work, not wanting to admit that I was financially struggling to help my parents, who I believed were in crisis. The isolation was painful, but I told myself it was temporary, that I was doing the right thing, that family comes first. Every sacrifice felt noble, meaningful, necessary. I was so blind. My coworkers started noticing changes in me. I looked tired all the time, stressed, worn down. I had always been the upbeat one in the office, the person who brought enthusiasm and positive energy to meetings. But now I was withdrawn, distracted, making mistakes I never would have made before. My boss called me into her office one afternoon and asked if everything was okay. I broke down and told her about my parents' financial crisis, about how I was helping them, about how stressed I was trying to manage everything. She looked at me with concern and said something that I dismissed at the time, but that would later haunt me. She said, "Are you sure they're being honest with you? That's a lot of money they're asking for." I was offended by the suggestion. How could she imply that my parents would lie to me? I defended them vigorously, explained all the circumstances, made it clear that I knew what I was doing and that my family situation was none of her business. She backed off, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't believe my parents, and that made me angry. I was so deep in denial, so committed to believing in the goodness of my parents, that I couldn't see what was obvious to an outside observer. The requests for money were excessive, the explanations were vague, and the pattern was unsustainable. But I didn't want to see it. Seeing it would mean acknowledging that the foundation of my entire life was built on a lie. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon in September, about 6 months after the initial phone call. I decided to surprise my parents with a visit. I hadn't told them I was coming. I wanted to bring them groceries and maybe cook them dinner to ease some of their burden. I had just received a small bonus at work, and instead of using it to pay down my debt or replenish my decimated savings, I wanted to spend it on them. I stopped at an expensive grocery store and filled my cart with things I thought they would enjoy. Premium steaks, fresh vegetables, imported cheeses, a nice bottle of wine. Things I couldn't afford for myself but wanted to provide for them. The groceries cost almost $200, money I didn't really have, but I felt good about it. I imagined their surprise, their gratitude, their appreciation for having a daughter who cared so much. When I pulled up to their house, the house they claimed they were about to lose, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a brand new luxury SUV in the driveway, gleaming in the afternoon sun, with temporary dealer plates still attached. It was a top-of-the-line model, the kind that cost $60,000 or $70,000. My father was outside washing it, whistling cheerfully, wearing expensive-looking casual clothes I had never seen before, looking relaxed and happy in a way that contradicted everything they had told me about their financial crisis. For a moment, I sat frozen in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing to find an innocent explanation. Maybe they had won something in a contest. Maybe it was a rental for some special occasion. Maybe a friend had lent it to them. Maybe I was misunderstanding the situation entirely. But deep in my gut, in that place where truth lives before logic catches up, I knew. Something was very, very wrong. I got out of my car slowly, my legs feeling weak, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my throat. My father looked up and saw me, and I watched his expression change in an instant. From contentment to surprise to something that looked almost like fear, like a child caught doing something wrong. He recovered quickly, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes, walking toward me with false enthusiasm. He started explaining before I even asked, his words tumbling out too fast, too defensive. He said the car was a gift from a distant relative who had passed away. Then he changed it and said it was a lease that was actually very affordable. Then he said they had gotten an amazing deal from a friend in the car business. 3 different stories in less than 2 minutes, each one contradicting the last. I could see my mother appearing at the front door, her face pale, her eyes wide with what I now recognize as panic. She was wearing a designer outfit I had never seen before, jewelry that looked expensive glinting at her neck and wrists. Everything about the scene before me contradicted the narrative of desperate poverty they had been feeding me for months. I wanted to believe them. God, how I desperately wanted to believe them. But I couldn't ignore what my instincts were screaming at me, couldn't unsee what was right in front of my eyes. I made an excuse about suddenly feeling sick, said I had to leave immediately, thrust the expensive groceries at my confused father, and drove away with my hands shaking so violently on the steering wheel that I had to pull over 3 blocks away. I sat in a parking lot and cried for an hour, my body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, the kind of crying that hurts your chest and leaves you gasping for air. I knew. In my heart, I knew the truth, even though my mind was still trying to deny it. That night was the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every request for money, every tearful explanation they had given me over the past 6 months. I got up and went through my laptop, pulling up every email they had sent, every text message, every bank transfer I had made. I created a spreadsheet documenting everything: dates, amounts, reasons given, conversations we had. The total amount I had given them was staggering. Over $40,000 in 6 months. My entire life savings, plus borrowed money, plus money I had drained from my retirement account. And for what? For a new luxury SUV and designer clothes while I was eating ramen and skipping social events because I couldn't afford a cup of coffee. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, like someone had reached into my chest and torn out pieces of me. But more than the money, what hurt was the lie. The elaborate, carefully constructed, months-long lie. Every conversation we had where they cried about their situation while knowing they were fine, knowing they were spending my money on luxuries while I struggled. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I was going to investigate. I needed to know the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. I couldn't move forward, couldn't decide what to do, until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The next morning, with hands that still shook from lack of sleep and emotional exhaustion, I started making calls. First, I called the county assessor's office and confirmed that my parents' house was not in foreclosure, was not at risk of foreclosure, and in fact had no liens or outstanding issues whatsoever. The mortgage had been paid off 3 years ago. That was the first confirmation that they had lied. Then I called their bank, claiming to be my mother. I knew enough personal information to pass their security questions, and discovered their account balances. They had over $90,000 in savings, not in crisis, not struggling, financially secure. That was the second confirmation. But I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof because part of me was still hoping, still desperately grasping for some explanation that would make all of this okay. So I hired a private investigator, spending $1,200 I didn't have, putting it on a credit card that was already close to maxed out. I gave him all the information I had and asked him to find out everything about my parents' recent financial activity. The wait for his report was agonizing. I went through the motions at work, barely able to concentrate, jumping every time my phone buzzed, thinking it might be him. I avoided my parents' calls, sending them to voicemail, unable to speak to them until I knew the truth. They left increasingly worried messages asking if I was okay, if something had happened, saying they missed me and wanted to see me. The audacity of their concern, knowing what I was beginning to suspect, made me feel physically ill. 3 weeks later, the investigator's report arrived in my email. I was at work when I got the notification. I locked myself in a bathroom stall to read it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone. What he had uncovered made me physically ill. I had to sit on the closed toilet lid with my head between my knees to keep from passing out. My parents weren't in financial trouble. They were thriving. They had recently returned from a 3-week luxury vacation to Europe. The investigator had obtained their credit card statements showing charges at 5-star hotels in Paris, Rome, and Barcelona. Expensive restaurants where single meals cost what I was spending on groceries for a week. Designer stores where they had dropped thousands of dollars on clothes and accessories. They had purchased not just the SUV I saw, but my mother had also bought a luxury sedan for herself 2 months earlier. They had made a down payment on a vacation property in Florida, a beachfront condo they were planning to use as a retirement getaway. The medical bills my father supposedly had? Fabricated. There was no record of any major medical procedures or expenses. The legal fees for their investment issues? Non-existent. There were no lawsuits, no legal problems, no investment losses. The home repairs they needed urgently? The investigator had driven by their house and taken photos. Everything looked perfect, well-maintained, freshly painted. Every single thing they had told me over the past 6 months was a calculated, deliberate, carefully constructed lie. Not a misunderstanding. Not an exaggeration. A lie. Designed specifically to manipulate me into giving them money they didn't need. Money they used to fund a lavish lifestyle while watching me struggle and sacrifice. I don't know how long I sat in that bathroom stall, reading and rereading the report, looking at the photos the investigator had included. My parents laughing at a sidewalk cafe in Paris, my mother carrying shopping bags from Chanel and Prada, my father raising a glass of wine at what was clearly an expensive restaurant. They looked happy, carefree, completely unburdened by the financial crisis they had described to me in such desperate detail. The grief I felt in that moment was overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was like mourning the death of 2 people who were still alive. The parents I thought I had, the ones who were honest and struggling and needed my help, were gone, had never existed. In their place were strangers, con artists, people who had looked me in the eyes and lied with such ease and conviction that I had never suspected a thing. I finally emerged from the bathroom, my face splotchy from crying, my eyes swollen. A coworker saw me and asked if I was okay. I mumbled something about a family emergency and left work early. I drove around aimlessly for hours, unable to go home, unable to face the reality of what I now knew, unable to decide what to do with this devastating information. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately. Part of me wanted to never speak to them again. Part of me still wanted to find some way this could all be explained, some scenario where they weren't the villains in this story. But there was no such scenario. The evidence was irrefutable. Have you ever had to confront someone you love with evidence of their betrayal? Have you ever had to look into the eyes of people you trust and tell them you know they've been lying to you? It's a kind of death, a killing of innocence and trust that can never be resurrected. 2 days after receiving the investigator's report, after I had cried myself out and reached a kind of numb acceptance of reality, I drove to my parents' house unannounced. I had the report printed out in a folder, along with my own spreadsheet of every dollar I had given them. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want to give them time to prepare their lies. I needed to see their faces when I confronted them with the truth. When my mother opened the door, her expression was initially happy, welcoming, immediately transforming to concern when she saw my face. She asked what was wrong, reached out to touch my arm, her voice full of motherly worry that now sounded like mockery. I brushed past her without answering, walked into the living room where my father was watching television, a room that looked freshly redecorated with furniture I didn't recognize, expensive-looking pieces that certainly weren't there last time I visited. I threw the folder onto the coffee table in front of him. He looked up at me confused, then down at the folder, then back at me. I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I know everything. I know you've been lying to me. I know you're not in financial trouble. I know about the vacation to Europe, the new cars, the condo in Florida. I know you've spent the last 6 months manipulating me, taking my money, watching me struggle while you lived in luxury. So I want you to look me in the eyes and tell me why. Tell me why you did this to your own daughter. The silence that followed felt eternal. My mother came into the room and saw the folder, saw the expression on my face, and I watched the color drain from her face. My father opened the folder with shaking hands and started looking through the documents. He couldn't deny them. They were credit card statements, bank records, hotel reservations, photos, all stamped and verified by the investigator. Official proof of every lie they had told. I expected denials. I expected more lies. I expected them to scramble for explanations, to try to manipulate me one more time. But what happened instead was somehow worse. They didn't deny it. My father closed the folder, sat back in his chair, and let out a long sigh. My mother sat down on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed. And then they tried to justify it. My mother looked at me with cold eyes that I barely recognized and said words I will never forget. Words that haunt me still. You were doing well. You could afford it. We're your parents. We raised you. We deserve to enjoy our lives too. We sacrificed everything for you when you were growing up. You owe us. She said it without shame, without remorse, as if it was perfectly reasonable to defraud your own child. My father nodded in agreement, adding, "We weren't going to ask you forever. We just wanted to enjoy ourselves while we're still young enough to appreciate it. You'll understand when you're our age." They genuinely believed they were entitled to my money, that raising me created a debt I should repay by funding their luxury lifestyle, that lying to me was acceptable because the end result, them having what they wanted, justified the means. I felt something break inside me in that moment, something fundamental that I don't think ever fully healed. My belief in the goodness of family, in the safety of parental love, in the foundation of trust that I thought was unshakable, it all shattered like glass. I realized that I had been nothing more than a resource to them, an ATM machine that happened to share their DNA, a means to an end they had been planning for who knows how long. I asked them how long they had been planning this. My father had the decency to look uncomfortable, but my mother answered without hesitation. "A few years. We saw how well you were doing, how much you were making, and we thought, why should she have all that money when she doesn't have kids or a mortgage or any real responsibilities? Why should we have to budget and save and deny ourselves when our daughter could help us live the life we deserve?" A few years. They had been planning to defraud me for years, waiting for the right opportunity, crafting their story, preparing their manipulation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a desperate act. It was calculated, premeditated, and executed without conscience. I stood there looking at these two strangers who wore my parents' faces, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. The grief would come later, the anger and pain and sense of loss, but in that moment, I just felt clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I picked up the folder, looked at them one last time, and said, "You're going to hear from my lawyer. You committed fraud, and you're going to face consequences." Then I walked out of that house, got in my car, and drove away without looking back. The decision to take legal action wasn't immediate, despite my words in that moment. It took me several more weeks of agonizing deliberation, talking to therapists, consulting with lawyers, crying until I had no tears left, lying awake night after night, wrestling with guilt and doubt and fear. Part of me wanted to walk away, to cut them off completely, and try to rebuild my life without ever looking back or engaging in the messy, public, painful process of a lawsuit. Part of me worried about what people would think, about being judged as a vindictive daughter who turned on her parents, about the family members who might take their side, about becoming the villain in a story where I was clearly the victim. But another part of me, the part that had been violated and exploited, needed justice. I needed them to face consequences for what they had done. I needed the world to know that I wasn't crazy, wasn't making this up, wasn't the ungrateful child they might try to paint me as. And practically speaking, I needed to try to recover the money I had given them. Money that had been obtained through fraud, through emotional manipulation, through the exploitation of my love and trust. I was drowning in debt. My credit score had plummeted. I was facing years of financial struggle because of their actions. Walking away would mean accepting that burden while they continued to live comfortably on money they had stolen from me. That felt like letting them win, like validating their belief that they were entitled to do this to me. So I found an attorney who specialized in family fraud cases. His name was Robert, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that I appreciated. When I told him my story, showed him all the evidence I had gathered, he didn't seem shocked. He told me he had seen similar cases before, that family financial abuse was more common than people realized, that the shame and stigma kept most victims silent. He said I had a strong case, that the evidence was clear, but he warned me about what I was facing. A lawsuit like this would be public. It would likely make the news. My family would hire their own lawyer who would try to destroy my credibility, paint me in the worst possible light, drag up every mistake I had ever made to convince a jury I was lying or mentally unstable. The process would be emotionally devastating, expensive, and time-consuming. There were no guarantees. Even with strong evidence, family cases were unpredictable because judges and juries had preconceived notions about family loyalty, about forgiveness, about what good children should do for their parents. He asked me if I was prepared for all of that. I thought about it for a long moment, sitting in his office with sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the air, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. And I said yes. I was prepared. Because the alternative, staying silent, letting them get away with it, carrying the weight of their betrayal alone, was worse than anything a courtroom could throw at me. So we filed the lawsuit. I sued my own parents for fraud, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, for unjust enrichment. The day the papers were served to them, I threw up 3 times, my body physically rejecting the reality of what I was doing. But I knew it was right. I knew it was necessary. I knew that I deserved justice. The legal process that followed was nothing short of brutal. My parents hired an expensive attorney, clearly using some of the money I had given them to pay for his services, which added another layer of painful irony to the situation. Their lawyer was a man named Marcus, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, who specialized in defending the indefensible by destroying the credibility of those who accused his clients. From the first preliminary hearing, his strategy was clear. He was going to paint me as a vindictive, mentally unstable, ungrateful daughter who was fabricating allegations against my loving, innocent parents because of deep-seated psychological issues stemming from my childhood. He claimed that I had given them the money as gifts, that there was no expectation of repayment, that I was now having buyer's remorse and looking for any excuse to punish my parents for imagined wrongs. In court documents, he brought up every childhood argument, every teenage rebellion, every moment of conflict from decades ago to build a narrative of me as a troubled, difficult child who had always had issues with authority and family. He got affidavits from distant relatives I barely knew, people who had only heard my parents' version of events, testifying about what difficult daughter I supposedly was. He even tried to suggest I had drug problems, based on the fact that I had experimented with marijuana in college like millions of other people. Every aspect of my life was scrutinized, twisted, and presented in the worst possible light. Meanwhile, I was going deeper into debt paying my own attorney, missing work for court appearances and meetings, losing sleep, losing weight, losing pieces of myself every single day. The stress manifested physically. I developed chronic headaches, my hair started falling out in clumps in the shower, I had panic attacks that would hit me out of nowhere. In the grocery store, at my desk at work, while driving. I'd have to pull over and sit on the side of the road, gasping for air, feeling like I was dying. My friends didn't know what to say to me. Some of them distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the family drama, perhaps afraid that if I could turn on my parents, I could turn on anyone. Others tried to help but didn't understand the depth of what I was going through. They offered well-meaning advice like, try to forgive them, or family is family, or is it really worth all this? They meant well, but their words felt like knives, suggesting that my pain wasn't valid, that I should just let it go. Only a few close friends really stood by me, sat with me through the worst moments, held me when I cried, reminded me that I was doing the right thing when I doubted myself. My partner at the time couldn't handle it and broke up with me 3 months into the lawsuit, saying it was too much drama, too much negativity, that I was too consumed by the case to be in a healthy relationship. That loss, on top of everything else, nearly broke me. There were nights I seriously considered dropping the lawsuit, just walking away from everything, maybe even walking away from life itself because the pain felt too overwhelming to survive. The preliminary hearings were nightmares. I had to sit in the same room as my parents, watch them whisper to their lawyer, see them occasionally glance at me with expressions that ranged from anger to contempt to what might have been regret, though I couldn't be sure and didn't want to care. They looked like victims in those hearings, playing their roles perfectly. My mother dabbed at her eyes with tissues, looking wounded and confused. My father sat with slumped shoulders, the picture of a broken man being persecuted by his own child. It was a performance, and they were convincing. My lawyer presented the evidence methodically, bank statements showing their financial stability when they claimed to be in crisis, the credit card statements from their European vacation, the records of their luxury vehicle purchases, the contract for their Florida condo, the investigator's report with photos and timeline. It was all there in black and white, irrefutable proof that they had lied to me repeatedly and systematically over months. But their lawyer countered with character witnesses who testified about what wonderful parents they had been, people who talked about how they had sacrificed for me my entire childhood, how they had worked multiple jobs to pay for my education, how they deserved to be supported in their retirement years. The witnesses painted a picture of selfless parents and an ungrateful daughter, and I could see some people in the courtroom nodding along, buying into the narrative. It became a public dissection of our entire family history, every moment of my life scrutinized and judged by strangers who didn't know me, didn't know the truth of what happened behind closed doors, who only saw what my parents wanted them to see. The judge assigned to our case was a woman named Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern figure in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, sharp, intelligent eyes, and an unreadable expression that gave nothing away. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, for not tolerating nonsense in her courtroom, for cutting through emotional manipulation to get to the facts. I couldn't tell if she believed me or if she thought I was exactly what my parents' lawyer claimed, a troubled, vindictive child attacking her innocent parents. She listened to everything without revealing what she thought, asking pointed questions of both sides, reviewing every document with careful attention. The uncertainty was torture. After each hearing, I would try to read her expression, to find some sign of what she was thinking, but she remained completely neutral. My lawyer told me that was actually a good sign, that Judge Morrison was known for keeping an open mind until all evidence was presented, but I couldn't shake the fear that when the time came, she would side with my parents, that the bias toward family unity and respect for parents would override the clear evidence of their fraud. As the trial date approached, my anxiety reached unbearable levels. I started having nightmares where I was in the courtroom and everyone was laughing at me, where the judge called me a liar and threw out my case, where my parents walked free while I was somehow the one being punished. I would wake up at 3 a.m, my heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat, unable to fall back asleep. I started having panic attacks multiple times a day. My therapist increased our sessions to twice a week, prescribed anxiety medication that helped slightly, but made me feel foggy and disconnected. Work became nearly impossible. I was making mistakes, missing deadlines, showing up late. My boss, the same one who had questioned my parents' story months ago, called me into her office for another talk. She said she could see I was struggling, that she wanted to support me, but that my performance was suffering and she needed to know if I could handle my job responsibilities. I broke down crying in her office, admitted I didn't know if I could handle anything anymore, that I felt like I was falling apart. She was kind. She offered me a temporary leave of absence, unpaid, but with the guarantee my job would be waiting when I was ready to return. I took it, knowing I couldn't afford the loss of income, but also knowing I couldn't continue functioning at work while fighting this legal battle. The first day of the actual trial arrived like a storm I had been watching approach for months. I walked into that courtroom feeling like I was walking to my own execution, wearing a conservative navy suit that a friend had lent me because I still couldn't afford to buy professional clothes, carrying a folder full of evidence that represented the complete demolition of my family, my childhood, my sense of who I was and where I came from. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. Word had gotten out about the case. Daughter sues parents for fraud. And there were reporters in the back rows, members of my extended family who had come to support my parents, a few friends who had come to support me. The atmosphere was tense, charged with judgment and curiosity. My parents sat on the opposite side of the room with their lawyer, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself really look at them. They looked older, tired, but there was still a hardness in their eyes that told me they weren't going to back down, weren't going to admit what they had done, weren't going to give me the closure of an apology or acknowledgement. This was war, and they intended to win. The opening statements set the tone for everything that followed. My lawyer, Robert, stood and presented our case clearly and factually. He outlined the timeline of deception, the specific lies my parents had told, the evidence proving those lies, the amount of money involved, the devastating impact on my life. He painted a picture of systematic financial abuse, of parents who had exploited their daughter's love and trust for personal gain. Then Marcus, my parents' lawyer, stood up and presented their side. According to him, I was a deeply troubled young woman with a history of mental health issues and drug use, someone who had always had a contentious relationship with my parents, who had given them money as gifts during a period when I was doing well financially, and who was now, for reasons related to my own psychological problems, trying to punish them by falsely accusing them of fraud. He said the money had been given freely, that there was never any misrepresentation, that my parents had simply accepted the generosity of their daughter, who they believed wanted to help them enjoy their retirement. He painted them as confused, hurt elderly people being attacked by their own child in a cruel and public manner. His performance was masterful, and I could see it working on some faces in the courtroom. The narrative he presented was simpler, more comfortable for people to accept than the truth, that parents could be capable of such calculated betrayal of their own child. The first 2 days of trial were excruciating. Witnesses testified for both sides. The investigator I had hired took the stand and presented his findings, walking the jury through the evidence he had gathered. He was professional, factual, unshakable under cross-examination. Marcus tried to discredit him, suggesting he had been paid to fabricate evidence, but the investigator calmly pointed out that all his evidence consisted of official documents and records that anyone could verify. Bank representatives testified about my parents' account balances and financial activity. The dealer who sold them the luxury SUV testified about the purchase. Staff from the hotels in Europe where they had stayed testified about their vacation. Document after document, witness after witness, the evidence piled up. But Marcus countered with character witnesses. People who had known my parents for years testified about what good people they were, how involved they had been in church and community, how they couldn't possibly have done what I was accusing them of. Extended family members testified about my supposed behavioral problems as a child and teenager. A distant cousin I barely remembered claimed I had stolen money from her purse at a family gathering when I was 15, a completely fabricated story designed to make me look like a dishonest person. I had to sit there and listen to lies being told about me under oath while my parents sat there playing the role of wounded innocents, and it took everything in me not to stand up and scream at the injustice of it all. Then came my turn to testify. I took the stand with my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it, my hands trembling, my mouth dry. My lawyer led me through my testimony, asking me to recount the entire story from the beginning. I told them about the first phone call from my mother, about every subsequent request for money, about the lies they told me, about how I had trusted them completely. I told them about the groceries I was eating, the sacrifices I was making, the debt I was going into while believing I was helping my parents in crisis. I told them about the day I saw the luxury SUV, about hiring the investigator, about confronting my parents with the evidence. I told them about my mother's words, "You owe us," and how those words shattered my understanding of what family should be. I testified for over 4 hours across 2 days, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I cried on the stand multiple times, which embarrassed me but couldn't be helped. The memories were too fresh, the wounds too raw. Every detail I recounted felt like reliving the trauma all over again. But I pushed through, determined to tell my truth as clearly and completely as possible. Then came Marcus's cross-examination, and it was brutal. He questioned every detail of my story, suggesting I was exaggerating or misremembering. He brought up my college marijuana use, implying I might have drug-induced memory problems. He asked about my mental health, about the therapy I was receiving, about the anxiety medication I was taking, trying to paint me as unreliable and unstable. He asked invasive questions about my finances, suggesting I had mismanaged my money and was looking for someone to blame. He grilled me about my relationship with my parents throughout my life, cherry-picking moments of conflict and presenting them as evidence of a long-standing antagonistic relationship. He even suggested that maybe I had given my parents the money and was now having financial regrets, trying to get it back through false accusations. Each question felt like an attack, each insinuation like a knife. I answered as honestly as I could, even when the truth made me look foolish or naive. I admitted that yes, I had trusted my parents blindly. Yes, I had given them money without demanding receipts or proof. Yes, I had believed their lies because I loved them. Marcus tried to use my love as evidence against me, suggesting that someone who truly loved their parents wouldn't drag them through court, wouldn't publicly humiliate them, wouldn't try to take back money given as gifts. I looked him in the eyes and said that someone who truly loved their child wouldn't defraud them, wouldn't lie to them for months, wouldn't watch them struggle while living in luxury funded by their daughter's savings. The courtroom was silent after that, and I saw Judge Morrison's expression shift slightly, though I still couldn't read what she was thinking. My parents also testified, and watching them lie under oath was surreal. My father claimed they had never told me they were in financial crisis, that I had misunderstood their casual comments about wanting to enjoy retirement more. He said the money I gave them was offered spontaneously as gifts, that they had tried to refuse, but I insisted. He painted a picture of a generous daughter who later regretted her generosity, and invented a crisis narrative to justify demanding the money back. My mother's testimony was similar but more emotional. She cried on the stand, talked about how much they loved me, how confused and hurt they were by my accusations, how they couldn't understand why I was doing this to them. She completely denied ever telling me they were at risk of losing their house, or that my father had medical bills, or that they had legal fees from bad investments. She claimed those were all my inventions, my misunderstandings, my false memories. Watching them lie so convincingly, so earnestly, was devastating. If I didn't have the evidence, if I didn't know the truth beyond any doubt, I might have believed them myself. They were that good at deception, that practiced at manipulation. It made me wonder how many times throughout my life they had lied to me and I had simply believed them, never questioning, never suspecting. On the third day of trial, something happened that changed everything. We had just finished hearing testimony from another character witness for my parents, when Judge Morrison, who had been listening to everything with that same unreadable expression, suddenly interrupted the proceedings. She looked directly at my parents' lawyer and said, in a voice that cut through the courtroom's murmur like a blade, "Counselor, I'd like to see complete documentation of your client's financial records for the period in question. Bank statements, credit card statements, loan applications, property purchases, tax returns, everything. I want a full financial picture." There was a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom. Marcus immediately objected, arguing that their financial records were irrelevant, that the question was whether my parents had misrepresented their financial situation to me, not what their actual situation was. But Judge Morrison was insistent, her voice firm and brooking no argument. If your clients are claiming they were in dire financial straits as they represented to their daughter, then their financial records will support that claim. If they were not, then those same records will show otherwise. The entire premise of your defense is that these gifts were given voluntarily without any misrepresentation. I want to see the objective truth of their financial situation during the period when they were allegedly asking for help. You have until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to produce these documents, all of them, complete and unredacted. If you cannot or will not produce them, I'll have to draw certain conclusions about why you're refusing. I watched my parents' faces go pale. I saw them lean over to whisper frantically to Marcus, their expressions panicked. And I felt, for the first time since this nightmare began, a small flutter of hope in my chest. The courtroom was dismissed for the day, and I went home in a daze. My lawyer was cautiously optimistic, saying that Judge Morrison's request was significant, that she clearly wasn't buying my parents' story completely and wanted hard evidence. But he warned me not to get my hopes up too high, that even if the financial records supported my case, we still had to convince the judge that my parents had intentionally misrepresented their situation, rather than that I had simply misunderstood. That night, I barely slept, my mind spinning with possibilities. What would those documents show? Would they corroborate my story and expose my parents' lies? Would the judge see through their manipulation or be fooled by their performance? I arrived at court the next morning early, my stomach in knots, my hands trembling as I clutched my coffee cup. The courtroom slowly filled with the same crowd as before. Reporters, family members, curious observers, everyone sensing that something important was about to happen. When Judge Morrison called the court to order, Marcus stood up with a thick folder in his hands. His usual confident demeanor was replaced with visible tension. He approached the bench and presented the folder to the judge, and I watched her face carefully as she began reviewing the contents. Judge Morrison spent 25 minutes reviewing those financial records in absolute silence, while everyone in the courtroom waited. You could hear people shifting in their seats, clearing their throats, the subtle sounds of discomfort and anticipation. I kept my eyes on the judge's face, trying to read any reaction, any sign of what she was thinking. Her expression remained neutral for most of the review, but I noticed small changes, a tightening around her eyes, a slight pressing of her lips, a subtle shake of her head at one point. Finally, she looked up from the documents and her gaze went directly to my parents. The expression on her face had changed. There was something there now that hadn't been before. Understanding, perhaps, or disappointment, or anger carefully controlled. She cleared her throat and said, in a voice that was cold and precise, "These financial records show no evidence of financial distress during the period in question. In fact, they show quite the opposite. Multiple large purchases, luxury expenditures, significant savings account balances. Would the defendants like to explain this discrepancy between their claimed financial crisis and the reality shown in these documents?" The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations, and Judge Morrison banged her gavel for silence. Marcus tried to recover, tried to explain, tried to redirect. He argued that his client's financial records after receiving money from me weren't relevant to whether they had been in crisis before. But Judge Morrison cut him off. "Counselor, these records show account balances and financial activity from before, during, and after the period when your clients were allegedly soliciting funds from their daughter due to financial hardship. At no point do these records reflect anything resembling a financial crisis. The purchase of luxury vehicles, the European vacation, the property acquisition in Florida. These all occurred during the time frame when your clients claim they were desperate for financial assistance. This is not a discrepancy that can be explained away. She then asked my parents directly if they had told me they were at risk of losing their house. My father hesitated, looked at his lawyer, then mumbled that maybe there had been some miscommunication. Judge Morrison asked if they had told me my father had significant medical bills. My mother said they might have mentioned some concerns about healthcare costs, but nothing specific. Back and forth it went, with Judge Morrison methodically going through each lie they had told me, and watching them squirm and hedge and try to minimize their deception was both vindicating and heartbreaking. The truth was finally being exposed in a public forum, but the cost of getting to this moment had been devastating. Judge Morrison then did something I hadn't expected. She requested a recess and asked to meet with both sets of lawyers in her chambers. The wait during that recess was agonizing. It lasted for over an hour, and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with my lawyer's paralegal, too anxious to eat or drink or do anything but stare at the wall and wonder what was happening behind closed doors. When everyone finally emerged, Marcus looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact with everyone. My lawyer had a small, cautiously optimistic expression. When court resumed, Judge Morrison announced that she had given the defendants an opportunity to settle the case, to admit wrongdoing, and agree to repay the money plus damages without forcing a completion of the trial. My parents, through their lawyer, had refused. They were maintaining their innocence and their story that I had given them gifts voluntarily. Judge Morrison looked disappointed by this response, made a note in her file, and said we would proceed with closing arguments the following day. That night, I had a conversation with my lawyer about what Judge Morrison's actions meant. He said it was highly unusual for a judge to so clearly telegraph her thoughts on a case before rendering a decision, that her request for complete financial records and her pointed questioning of my parents suggested she wasn't buying their story. But he cautioned me again about assuming anything. Family law cases were unpredictable, and judges sometimes ruled in unexpected ways based on considerations that weren't always apparent. I went to bed that night feeling a strange mix of hope and dread, unable to fully believe that justice might actually prevail, but also terrified of what would happen if it didn't. The closing arguments the next day were the final battle. My lawyer summarized all the evidence, emphasized the clear pattern of deception, highlighted the inconsistencies in my parents' testimony, and the irrefutable truth shown in their financial records. He talked about the emotional and financial damage they had caused me, about the betrayal of parental trust, about the need for accountability and justice. Marcus gave his closing argument defending my parents, still trying to paint me as a troubled, vindictive daughter despite all the evidence to the contrary. But even he seemed less confident than before, his words lacking the conviction they had carried earlier in the trial. Then, it was over. Judge Morrison said she would take everything under consideration and render her decision within the week. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt completely drained, like I had nothing left inside me, like I had given every piece of myself to this fight, and now there was nothing to do but wait. The decision came 4 days later. I received a call from my lawyer early in the morning telling me to come to the courthouse immediately, that Judge Morrison was ready to deliver her ruling. I drove there with my heart in my throat, barely able to breathe, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. When I walked into the courtroom, I saw my parents already seated with their lawyer, looking tense and pale. Judge Morrison took the bench and the room fell silent. What she said next changed everything. She began by acknowledging the difficulty of cases involving family members, the tragedy of family relationships breaking down to the point of litigation. But then she said that regardless of family ties, the law was clear about fraud, about misrepresentation, about the exploitation of trust for financial gain. She went through the evidence point by point, explaining why she found my testimony credible and my parents' testimony not credible. She noted that their financial records directly contradicted their claims of financial hardship. She noted that they had refused opportunities to settle and admit wrongdoing, instead choosing to maintain lies even under oath. She said that the evidence clearly showed a pattern of calculated, deliberate, systematic fraud perpetrated against their daughter for personal financial gain. Her words were precise, damning, leaving no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. Then came the judgment. Judge Morrison ordered my parents to repay me every cent they had taken, the full $43,000 I had given them over 6 months, plus interest calculated from the date of each transfer, plus my legal fees, which had mounted to nearly $20,000. plus additional damages for emotional distress, which she set at $15,000. The total amount they owed me was staggering, over $85,000. More than double what they had taken, more than I had even dared to hope for, enough to not only recover my losses, but to compensate me for the damage they had caused. But more important than the money was the validation. Judge Morrison's words confirmed what I had known in my heart, but had been made to doubt countless times. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't vindictive. I wasn't wrong. I had been the victim of a calculated, cruel deception, perpetrated by the two people who should have protected me above all others. As Judge Morrison read her decision, I felt tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of finally being heard and believed after months of being called a liar and attacked and made to feel like I was the one in the wrong. My lawyer squeezed my hand, and I looked across the courtroom at my parents one last time. My mother was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of anger, of being caught, of losing. My father looked defeated, slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. And I felt complicated emotions. Not triumph exactly, not satisfaction, but a kind of hollow relief mixed with profound grief. The parents I thought I had were definitely, irrevocably gone, and in their place were these strangers who had been willing to destroy their own daughter for money and luxury. It was a Pyrrhic victory in many ways. I had won the case, but I had lost my family. The aftermath of the trial was strange and disorienting in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The story made local news the next day. Judge rules parents defrauded own daughter, orders massive repayment, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about my family's dirty laundry aired in public. The comment sections of news articles were vicious battlegrounds. Some people praised me for standing up for myself, calling me brave and strong. Others condemned me for taking my parents to court, calling me heartless, vindictive, an ungrateful child who should be ashamed of herself regardless of what they had done. I received hate mail at my apartment, strangers somehow finding my address and sending me letters telling me I was going to hell for what I had done to my parents, that I had violated sacred family bonds, that I was the real monster in this situation. At the same time, I received supportive messages from people who had been through similar situations, thanking me for having the courage to fight back, telling me their own stories of family financial abuse that they had never reported or pursued. I didn't know how to process any of it. I had wanted justice, and I had gotten it, but I hadn't fully considered how public and ugly the aftermath would be. My parents, as expected, appealed the decision immediately. They hired yet another lawyer, continuing to drain their resources to avoid accountability. The appeal dragged on for 13 more months, 13 months of continued stress and uncertainty, 13 months of not being able to fully move on or heal because the case was still hanging over me. During that time, I had to rebuild my life from scratch. I went back to work, trying to focus on my career and regain the professional standing I had lost during the trial. My colleagues were generally supportive, but also somewhat awkward around me, not knowing what to say or how to act around someone whose family drama had been so publicly displayed. Some friendships that had frayed during the trial never fully recovered, but I also found unexpected support from people I barely knew. Coworkers who shared their own stories of family betrayal, neighbors who left encouraging notes on my door, strangers who reached out through social media to tell me I had inspired them to set boundaries with toxic family members. The experience, as painful as it was, connected me to a community of people who understood what it was like to be betrayed by those who should love you most. The appellate court ultimately upheld Judge Morrison's decision with only minor modifications to the interest calculations. My parents were ordered to begin payments immediately. They were forced to sell their Florida condo to raise the funds. They had to downsize from their house to a smaller condo, selling the home I grew up in to pay their debt to me. Part of me felt guilty about that, which I hated and had to work through extensively in therapy. Why should I feel guilty for them facing the consequences of their own actions? But programming from childhood runs deep, and even after everything they had done, some small voice inside me whispered that I should have been more forgiving, more understanding, more willing to let it go and preserve the family. My therapist helped me recognize that voice as the result of manipulation that had probably been happening my entire life, training me to prioritize their needs and wants over my own well-being, teaching me that my role was to give and sacrifice while they took without consequence. Breaking free of that programming was harder than winning the court case in some ways. It's been 3 years now since that courtroom victory, and I'm still processing, still healing, still rebuilding. I've paid off all the debt I incurred helping my parents and fighting them in court. My savings account is growing again, slowly but steadily. My credit score has recovered. Financially, I'm in a better place than I've been in years, ironically more stable than I was before my parents targeted me. But emotionally, the scars run deep. I've had to completely redefine what family means to me, reconstruct my understanding of trust and relationships, learn how to open up to people again without the constant fear that they'll exploit my kindness. I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or DNA or who raised you. It's defined by respect, honesty, genuine care, and mutual support. The family I have now consists of close friends who proved their loyalty during the darkest time of my life, a partner I met 2 years ago who has shown me what healthy love looks like, mentors and colleagues who have supported my professional growth, a chosen family built on foundations of trust and reciprocity rather than obligation and manipulation. I've learned profound lessons through this experience that changed me fundamentally as a person. I learned that boundaries aren't cruel or selfish. They're essential for survival and self-respect. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to continue hurting you or pretending that abuse didn't happen. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from toxic people, even if they're family, even if society tells you that's wrong. I learned that my worth isn't determined by how much I sacrifice or how much I give or how much pain I'm willing to endure in the name of family loyalty. It's inherent, unchangeable, not dependent on my willingness to accept mistreatment. I learned that fighting for yourself isn't selfish or vindictive. It's self-preservation. It's dignity. It's claiming your right to be treated with basic respect. I learned that justice exists, even when it's hard-won and comes at a terrible cost, even when the process is brutal and the victory feels hollow. I learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible, that I can survive betrayal that once would have destroyed me, that I can stand in front of a courtroom full of people and tell my truth even when my voice is shaking and everything inside me wants to hide. Most importantly, I learned that recognizing that I deserve better than what my parents gave me isn't arrogance or entitlement. It's simply acknowledging my basic human dignity, my right to honesty and respect and genuine love rather than manipulation and exploitation. I haven't spoken to my parents since the final court date when the appellate decision was read. They've tried reaching out sporadically over the 3 years since, emails that swing wildly between apologetic and accusatory, sometimes within the same message, unable to fully commit to either genuine remorse or complete defensiveness. Birthday cards that show up in my mail that I throw away unopened. Not even curious about what they say anymore. Voicemails left on my phone that I delete without listening. Their voices alone enough to trigger anxiety even now. They showed up at my apartment building once about a year ago, but I refused to let them up. Called building security when they wouldn't leave. Watched from my window as they finally walked away looking defeated and old. Some people in my life still tell me I should give them another chance, that I'll regret it when they're gone, that time heals all wounds, that family is family no matter what. But I know my truth now in a way I didn't before all of this happened. Some wounds don't need to heal. They need to be acknowledged, honored, protected from further injury. Some relationships are so fundamentally broken, so poisoned at their core, that trying to fix them would only damage you further. And some people, regardless of their biological relationship to you, have proven themselves incapable of the basic respect and honesty required for any healthy relationship. I'm at peace with my decision in a way that surprises me sometimes. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come quickly. For the first year after the trial, I was constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I had done the right thing, plagued by guilt and doubt and grief. But gradually, through therapy and time and building new relationships based on genuine mutual care, I reached a place where I can think about what happened without falling apart, where I can tell this story without my voice breaking, where I can look at myself in the mirror and see someone who fought for herself and won, someone who refused to accept mistreatment even when that refusal cost her dearly. The grief still surfaces sometimes, usually when I least expect it, seeing a father-daughter dance at a wedding, hearing someone talk about family traditions, during holidays when the absence of family feels particularly acute. But it's a clean grief now. Mourning for what I never really had rather than torturing myself over what I lost. Because I've come to understand that the loving parents I thought I had were an illusion I created to survive my childhood with my psyche intact. If you're going through something similar right now, if you're being manipulated or exploited by family members, if you're wondering whether you have the right to protect yourself from people who share your DNA, I want you to know with absolute certainty that you do. You have every right to set boundaries, to say no, to demand honesty and respect, to walk away when those basic requirements aren't met, to take legal action if necessary to protect yourself and seek justice. It doesn't make you a bad person. a bad son or daughter, ungrateful or vindictive or cruel. It makes you someone who values themselves enough to refuse mistreatment, regardless of where it's coming from or what title the abuser holds in your life. I know how hard it is because I lived it. I know the guilt feels overwhelming, like you're betraying everything you were taught about family loyalty. I know the fear of being alone, of losing family, of having people judge you can be paralyzing, can make you want to just endure the abuse rather than face the consequences of fighting back. I know that standing up for yourself when family is involved feels like breaking a sacred rule, like doing something fundamentally wrong even when you know rationally that you're the one being wronged. But I also know from the other side of this nightmare that living authentically with dignity and self-respect is worth more than maintaining relationships that require you to diminish yourself, to accept lies, to allow exploitation, to sacrifice your well-being for people who don't reciprocate that care. You deserve to be treated with kindness, honesty, and genuine love that doesn't come with conditions or expectations of unlimited tolerance for mistreatment. And if the people in your life, family or otherwise, can't or won't give you that basic respect, then you deserve to find people who will. That's not selfish or unreasonable or asking too much. That's simply refusing to accept less than what every human being deserves in their relationships. That's survival. That's self-love. That's what I wish someone had told me years before I lost my savings, my mental health, my sense of security, and ultimately my family to people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I want you to know that you're not responsible for managing other people's emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their own actions, even if those people are your parents. You're not required to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. You're not obligated to endure abuse in the name of family loyalty. And you're not wrong for wanting justice, for wanting your truth acknowledged, for wanting the people who hurt you to face appropriate consequences. Now I want to hear from you, because your voice and your story and your experience matter just as much as mine. And this community we're building here together is stronger when we share and support each other. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely with your whole heart? Have you ever had to make the impossible choice between protecting yourself and maintaining a relationship with family? Have you ever felt torn between what you know is right for you and what society tells you should do? Drop your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you're not alone in whatever you're facing. This community is a judgment-free zone where we can support each other through these difficult, painful, often isolating situations. If this story touched your heart, if you felt seen or validated or less alone hearing what I went through, if it gave you strength or perspective or hope that justice is possible even in family situations, please leave a like on this video. Your likes tell me and the YouTube algorithm that this content matters, that sharing these painful truths is making a difference in people's lives, that you want to see more real stories about real people facing real challenges and finding their way through to the other side. Understanding these dynamics of family manipulation, financial abuse, emotional exploitation is so critically important because it helps us recognize the patterns before they completely destroy us, helps us give language and validity to experiences that often leave us feeling confused and guilty and crazy, helps us know that we're not alone in facing these impossible situations that seem designed to have no good solution. If you want more stories like this one, authentic stories about courage and survival and fighting for yourself, even when it's absolutely terrifying, stories about people who refused to accept mistreatment and found the strength to seek justice, please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales. This channel is dedicated to sharing real experiences of people who faced betrayal, manipulation, abuse, injustice, and who found the strength to fight back and reclaim their lives and rebuild their sense of self. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss a story that might give you the validation, strength, or perspective you need for your own battles, whatever they may be. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Whatever you're facing right now, whatever betrayal you're processing, whatever impossible decision you're struggling with, there's a whole community here of people who understand from their own experience, who've been through similar pain and come out the other side, who are cheering for your healing and success and happiness. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my pain and my struggle and my victory, for being part of this journey and this community. Your support, your engagement, your willingness to hear these difficult truths means absolutely everything to me and to everyone else who finds strength in knowing they're not alone. I hope my experience helps you in whatever way you need it most. Whether that's validation that your feelings are justified, courage to set necessary boundaries, strength to fight for justice, or simply the comfort of knowing someone else has walked a similar path and survived. Stay strong, trust yourself, protect your peace, and never forget that you deserve to be treated with dignity, respect, honesty, and genuine care, no matter who's failing to give you that. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, take care of yourself in all the ways you deserve.